Howdy folks, I'm Mark Gordon. Welcome back to Nomad Boatbuilding. Now today we're going to build a model of a Greenlandic Tahe kayak. Now the Greenlandic kayak is a thing unto itself, and the Tahe kayak is a fiberglass interpretation of the Greenlandic kayak form. This is essentially a reverse engineering of that form, that fiberglass form, into a wooden framework, which is not exactly straightforward. There are aspects of the fiberglass hull form that are very difficult to achieve in a wooden version. That's because the fiberglass boat does not have to conform to the same physical constraints that building in wood does. It's able to have certain forms that are fairly challenging to produce in wood, and this is not an exact copy of that form, but it is sort of a reasonable middle point between the traditional methodology that I use for building any Greenlandic kayak and trying to come as close to those lines as is reasonable without straying from the normal process that I use. So there's a few things here I've done a bit differently than the normal process, but that's just in the interest of trying to match the Tahe lines. This is intended to be a companion to a set of builder's notes I've put together on creating a wooden version of the Greenlandic Tahe kayak. That too is not prescriptive. That too is just to provide some insight into my thought process as I do this. This is essentially a video and paper sketchbook about my process of trying to recreate the Tahe kayak form in wood. I think it turned out to be a pretty nice looking kayak unto itself, if not exactly the same as the Tahe. I'd be perfectly happy to paddle this boat. If you're interested in trying this yourself, I've got a set of drawings available on my website. They are not prescriptive. They are not telling you exactly how to build this boat, but what they do contain are a bunch of drawings to help sort of describe what the basic form of it might be. And it includes a set of lines that I took off of an actual Tahe kayak. So that would be, if there's one thing that's prescriptive, it's taking those lines and working back from them to figure out how you're going to build the shape. So these Tahe drawings are really more of a general reference to help you get closer to that Tahe shape, not intended to be a really prescribed set of plans. This is why I say that it's for an intermediate builder. It's for someone who's already familiar with the skin on frame building process and who can make some of these judgment calls themselves. And go check that out if you're interested, and I've tried to keep the price relatively reasonable for that. There'll be digital downloads. If you really want a paper copy, you got nowhere to get something like that printed out close to home, I can send you a paper copy too. Just drop me an email and we'll work out a deal for that. Hope you enjoyed this build. We'll catch you at the other end. Now, I want to preface this by saying I'm not building a Tahe kayak because I specifically think Tahe Greenland style kayaks are superior in any way to any other variety of Greenland kayak. But they happen to be a manufactured kayak that closely emulates the traditional Greenlandic style or lines. Now, the issue I have with most manufactured products is that they are produced to fit a specific range of users. And the beauty of building traditional Greenland kayaks is you can build them to fit one user really nicely. So from that perspective alone, I don't think it's an advantage to build something that just matches what's out there on the market in the form of a plastic boat. However, some people particularly like that boat, and so by doing this, you can build one that is a good bit lighter than the existing plastic Tahe, or in theory it's a carbon fiber boat, carbon fiber / Kevlar boat, but it's not that light really. Anyhow, so I've had a request to produce one of these models. I'm going to be doing it at 1/3 scale, which is a little larger than I usually do my models. So it's going to be about 5.5 feet long in total. So the trick with building a Tahe style Greenland kayak is that the gunnels have got quite a bit of shear to it. So I think this was a model when I was doing the first one, I was trying to work out how much shear the gunnels needed to have. So when I'm doing Greenland kayaks, we usually have gunnels that are made here's a good example where this is short, but it's a good example where the gunnels are just dead straight. And when we kick them on an angle and then bend them end to end, spread in the middle, it creates shear. It creates this sweep to the shear. The Tahe has a nominal 20-degree angle amidships. Now, in the tradition of building the skin-on-frame kayaks, we maintain that exact same angle throughout the whole length of the gunnels. In the case of the Tahe, it actually changes angles towards the tail end, and I can't remember if it changes a bit towards the fore end. I'm not going to be doing that because that's a big pain in the butt to do, and it detracts from the methodology that I use. And so this Tahe copy is not, there's going to be things that differ from it. So we're trying to use the simplified method of building skin-on-frame boats and achieve something that's as close to the Tahe lines as we can get. And of course, the Tahe plastic boat doesn't have any internal structure, right? It's just a skin. So, and we've got to have a framework inside in order to achieve that shape. So right there's at least 3/4 of an inch of height that we can't quite mimic exactly and still have a person fit in the same way, or fit in and have the same clearances. So there's a bit of a compromise we have to make there. So when creating the Tahe gunnels, we need to give them shear, and I've worked out that they need approximately 2 inches of sweep over the full length of the gunnels when it's in their unangled and bent form. So when they're just dead straight, they can't be dead straight. And so there's different ways you can achieve this. I've come up with basically 3 different ways. You either start with a wider piece of material, and it needs to be to achieve the gunnel depth that I use in my kayaks, which is about 2.5 inches for a Greenland kayak. We need 4.5 inches, so say 5 inches of rough overall wide stock to saw the whole shape out. So that's one way of doing it. Another way to do it is to use 1x2s and stack them up and bend them to shape. 3 3/4 inch wide pieces stacked on top of each other and bent to that shape. Could make it 7/8 if you want a little deeper. The third way is to do what I've done here, which is to take the straight stick, plot the amount of sweep I want, take it off the bottom and glue it onto the top. The whole bottom was cut into a curve and then parked on top of it and then glued back together so that we achieved that curve. So right now I'm at the point where I just need to sort of fair these out because they're a bit lumpy. Having to work with a tiny little bandsaw does not make for the smoothest cut because just the limitations of the light blades. So I'm going to be just fairing off these gunnels with a plane here, bringing them down to their finished width, and then we're going to move on to the next step, which is actually shaping these into the gunnel blanks. And there's a few different operations I do when I do that. The top edge of these gunnels is going to get a little bevel that will create basically a flat across the gunnels after they're bent into shape. And that way you don't get a sort of a peak inboard of the gunnel edge. it's equal to the 20 degrees these gunnels are going to be bent to. Okay, now I need to find my midpoint. I square it all the way around. And that becomes an ongoing reference point for the gunnels. Next, if there's any variation in that curve, I want to decide which is my bow, which is my stern. And it shouldn't matter in this case, because I've made these essentially equal from side to side, but they might have a little bit of a trend one way or the other. And this end feels a little higher, so I'm going to make that my bow. So on the bottom for now, I'm just going to use I usually do this on the top as well, but I haven't beveled that top off yet. But I'll usually just add an arrow pointing to one end or the other. Now the very end of these need to get squared off. They're just rough cut now. Now on the bottom, I'm just going to mark my center with a C. And now I'm going to mark out where all my features are going to be. So on the bottom, we're going to have a whole pile of mortise holes. And on the sides, we're going to be marking where all the deck beams go. My methodology is such that from my center point, I come back 1 foot, that is one of the paddler's foot lengths, from the center line, and that's where the backrest nominally goes. And we usually throw it another couple inches further back to allow for layback rolls. That's the starting point. From there, we go 18 inches, or a cubit is how I actually do it. Back from that, which is where I put my deck beams. And then I'll measure a distance for where the knee brace and the mast go. You adjust yourself to a good seating position and you mark where the ball of your foot or your toe is going to be, because that's where you're going to be bearing against your deck beams. Usually fairly high up on the toe, not so much down here unless you really want to shift your deck beam down. I'll measure what the distance is from my lower back to where I want support. That'll be the knee brace. Then the mastic sits right in behind that. It's a double deck beam. Now we're doing the Tahe, so I'm going to be pulling these dimensions right off of my drawings. But those drawings are just generally arranged around the already existing features of the Tahe. With my Tahe plants, the most critical dimension is really just the dimensions for the gunnels, that is, the length of the gunnel and the rise of the gunnel. If you get those done properly, that is, by rise I mean this amount of sweep, if you get that done properly, it all sort of falls into place. Now you're intended to sort of just kind of scale off the drawing, but bear in mind that all the deck beams and those sort of features that I've put onto the Tahe drawing are not positioned relative to a real paddler. So you might you would probably want to check with the intended paddler for the exact positions of, say, the knee brace and the foot brace. Now that might affect the length of your cockpit and things like that. All right, next I'm going to do some mortising of my gunnels. I've laid out mortises every 9 inches relative to the scale. And I use a hand span when I'm doing this. I don't measure it at all. I tend to just work from the cockpit out, just eyeballing it. I don't get too fussy about exactly where I'm putting ribs. What I don't want is a rib landing in the forward sections of the boat just forward of a deck beam, and in the aft sections of the boat just aft of a deck beam. So every place that I lash a deck beam, I come towards the narrow end of the boat 1 finger's width back from the edge of that deck beam, so like about 3/4 of an inch. and then about a finger's width up from the bottom, about 3/4 of an inch. And that's basically like the depth of the rib mortise. So I don't want a rib landing right on that lashing spot. That's what I'm trying to say. You could always lash to the other side of the deck beam if you want, but I prefer to lash on the side where the triangle is getting narrower as opposed to the other side. If you want to put seating on top of ribs, you might want to throw in a couple extra ribs in that immediate seating area. Or if you'd like to eliminate ribs in the seating area, which is my preference for getting your body as low as possible in a narrow boat, then you might want to make sure that that first rib is back just a little bit, like either directly under that aft deck beam, the backrest deck beam, or behind it. And if you look at Brian Schultz's method, he's got a nice little system for setting up like a sling seat in here to support you. So if you want to do that, you just need to be conscious about where you're putting these ribs. For the purpose of the model, I don't really care too much. This is essentially a mimic of what my full-size rudder is set up with, although I don't use wooden guides. I have little aluminum angles that are fastened to my rudder base for doing mortising, plunge rudder. And I like to mortise these with both ribs joined together. So you do one side and then you flip your rudder around and do the other side. And the reason for that is it gives you a better base to run the rudder on if they're doubled up. If it's just a single 3/4 inch wide gunnel, it's a little harder to keep everything plumbed up nicely. I mean, the guides help, but it also helps a lot more if you have both gunnels sandwiched together for doing that. Of course, that means that your router bit has to be offset to one side of your clamping setup. So you do it whichever way you like. Part of the reason I do that is because normally when I'm making these things, I will make up the gunnels as a single 2x piece of material, do the mortising and marking and all that sort of stuff and shape the ends, and then I'll split them into two on the table saw and thickness them to my finished thickness afterwards. So that's just a methodology that is sort of ingrained into the way I do it. But there are plenty of times where I'm working with different stock that I have to just sandwich them together instead. Depth of mortises, nominally minimum 3/4 of an inch to an inch deep. Any deeper than that, you're probably wasting your time. So one of the minor details I like to take care of along the way is just breaking edges. So this bottom edge, now that my mortises are done, is all cleaned up and it's finished. And so I just want to take my little plane here, and I'm just taking the tiniest little bit off, so it's a soft corner, little soft chamfer. And I prefer to do this than sanding it, because this just looks a lot sharper when you're done. Just a few strokes. We're not trying to do a big molded detail here. Just make it anything but sharp. I'm doing what will be my inside ones at the moment while these gunnels are still stuck together. But once they come apart, we'll take care of the outside corners. Of course, you're watching or feeling for your grain direction. Yellow cedar, it can be so fine. It can be hard to see the grain direction, and even when you can see it, sometimes it's deceiving. And sometimes there's been enough spiral growth in the tree that it's going in the opposite direction that you think relative to the way the piece of wood's been cut. With that done, I want to bevel the top of my gunnels. So, and what we're doing is we're doing the equivalent of a 20-degree bevel on the top edge, so that once these gunnels are kicked over to the 20 degrees that they're going to be, use this as an example, once they're kicked over to the 20 degrees, rather than these inside corners being proud, they're going to be flattened out. So we're taking them down so where they'll be flat across the top, and there'll just be a slight a slight chamfer on the remaining corner, which in this case will be the inside of our joint gunnels. So we're not trying to take this bevel right to the center line, right to where the two are joined together. We're going to leave a little flat spot. And in our full-size boat, that flat spot is about 1/4 inch on either side of that center line. And this amount that we take it down on the sides normally is usually about 1/8 of an inch. We don't get too fussy about what the exact angle is, so you can use that as a general rule and it'll look better when it's done. But if you want to get it like dead flat, so that when you're seeing the finished boat, you see the sides come up, just the tiniest chamfer to soften the corner, and then there's nothing stopping the skin from bridging, then you need to be a little more careful about what that angle is. What I'll do is I'll just go down the whole length of the boat, just like so. I could even do this with my larger plane. It's actually easier to do this on a full-size boat. With these heavily curved gunnels, it makes it a little bit more difficult because they don't want to sit flat on a bench, obviously. It's a big banana. I feel my grain's actually going the other direction. Actually, going this way. Because it's so hard to see what you're doing on here, it helps to put some registration marks on there that as you plane these away, I can see what's left behind. Like so. Just a few little marks in the center. I gotta kick this one over a little harder.
On the bottom of the gunnels at both ends, we're going to remove a wedge that has a ratio of about 1:6. This is to facilitate the joinery that happens at the ends of the boats, and it also gives us a surface that the stem will later register against and be fastened to. On the top of the gunnels, we're just going to cut a notch. It's about the same length as that wedge. Usually in the real boat it's about 6 inches long and usually about 1/2 inch deep. This is going to get tuned later on after the gunnels are assembled, and the deck is eventually going to sit down into this notch.
Now I just need to spread my gunnels. So the orientation we had before now gets reversed. What was formerly on the outside now gets flopped to the inside, and that way all of our deck beam markings land on the inside of the boat. And that bevel we did is now raking inboard, but as soon as this tips like that, it's going to be level. So I'm just going to drop an elastic onto the gunnels here, and that's just to help provide a little bit of tension as I set the spreader in the middle. Now you can put this spreader right on the midships point, or you can put it near the backrest. I usually put it right on the midships, the center line mark that I created earlier. So this elastic, you got to kind of sandwich it around where the spreader is for it to stay put. You drop one of these keepers onto the outside, drop another one on the other end. Other spreaders, drop our keeper on there. And this is where we get into actually tuning the shape of the boat. Between the keeper and these spreaders, we can play around with how much hollow the boat has. You might adjust the width of these so they're not necessarily so close together. So to get the ball rolling, what we want to do is have just both ends touching. We want to just have these ends touching right here because we need to kerf these together so that we get a joint between these ends. In a perfect world, these ends are flush with each other, but it could take a whole bunch of juggling to get them like that. It's not really worth putting a lot of effort into that until you start getting these ends curved together. But I like to get them close and get an idea as to how much of an angle I need to chop into these ends.
Brian Schultz at Cape Falcon Kayaks uses a jigsaw to do this little operation right here. It works pretty good. I've tried it before. I've also tried doing it with a circular saw and hand saw, but I find I get the job done a little bit faster just using a chisel or a slick or something to knock out the bulk of the material to start with. The most difficult part of this kerfing is just trying to stabilize the ends of the gunnels so they don't slide around on you. I'll often put a small cleat across the tops of the gunnels and clamp them down to the sawhorse that I'm working on. That works pretty good. And then I also use this technique here where I crisscross them in order to use a block plane to try and fine tune that shape. Because the kerfing works okay, but it can be a little bit frustrating to try and get it just so. Now, if you wanted to try and graphically lay out where this line is going to be ahead of time, it's a bit tricky to do. I've sometimes done it using a string line. The point at which the string needs to anchor is at that first spreader, because that is essentially the fulcrum around which this triangle you're creating swings. So if you have your center line there, and then you stretch your string out and touch it on the two spots that you want to eventually come together, you're going to get a marginally accurate line that you can follow. But still, you're going to have to go through all this kerfing activity as well. Now the goal is to get the outer lower corners the same width as your stem material.
Once I've got my ends connected together, I would usually just leave them dry. In recent years, I've been using a hot glue gun for temporarily holding these joints, and just because it makes life so much easier to have an adhesive in there that just tack it together. You could be using CA glue or anything else, but I just find hot glue really fast and efficient, and if I need to take it apart, it's really easy to do so. I can kind of easily saw it apart or wrestle it apart. So I just use a couple little dabs. Once these ends are connected, and we've got a nice clean joint running right through there, our goal is to have this bottom of this joint be nominally the thickness of your stem material. The upper portion can be a little bit wider, it's fine. We're going to be flattening this off so the stem rides on top of it, but before that we need to join them together, and I usually just use 3 dowels running right through here, and I'll toenail them slightly so that they've got some holding power all on their own. Now there's also going to be some lashing going on in between those dowels, so it's a good idea to take your time to try and space these out so that you've got enough room between each dowel for the lashings to come. So I usually start by putting one closest to the very end where there's a lot of solid material. You got to start your drill sort of square to the face until it bites, and then you can swing it up into the angle that you want. Just go all the way through. Now in this case, I don't have a ton of connection down here because it's a fairly full bow. Sometimes when it's a hollow form in here, there's a larger connection, so I don't think I'm going to bother putting another dowel in on this particular model. I'll just leave the 2 dowels in this particular case. Now it'll work out just fine. And so our dowels are just going to be toothpicks. So I've sized my drill bit accordingly. We'll just get a little bit of glue going here and just stuff them in and clip them off with some wire cutters. And then after the glue is cured, then we'll come back and we'll clean them up. Now my glue pot is just going to be this little block with a hole drilled in it. We've got one hole that's going to just hold any old carpenter's glue, or white glue if you want. Fish glue, doesn't matter. Just fill that up. And then it's good to go. All I gotta do is dip my toothpick in there a little bit. Feed it through my hole. Call it good. The other one I'll use for cyanoacrylate glue at some point. With the end pinned, now I can put a restraining lashing in here. So usually I go roughly in between the first and second deck beam. The primary purpose is to keep the angle of these gunnels after it's all taken apart. Once it's just deck beams here and these keepers are not in place, we want to be able to make sure that these gunnels are hanging into their angle. This sort of first lashing is just sort of like a collar tie. So if we flip this over, there's my first ribs. And I think in this case, I'm just going to put it in front of the ribs, but I'll put it anywhere in this whole range. If I've got a boat that's got a lot of hollow in here, that's where I'm going to put it, right where I want the least volume, where you've got a concavity in the gunnels. That's the spot I want it. In this case, these are fairly moderate gunnels. They don't really have concavity to them, so I can put them anywhere. So I'll put them a little bit further forward where they'll be away from these ribs and won't be a problem. So I'm just going to eyeball what would be square, and I'm just going to go straight across. So something like this. Okay, and we come down what would be the equivalent of about a finger's width. And I just go square through the gunnel, but you could aim straight across if you wanted to. In a proper boat, because this is usually a larger lashing, I'll often notch the gunnels here to give the lashing a little bit of space to sort of set down flush so it isn't protruding out. I'm not going to do that for the model. That's what I would normally do. All right, with some sinew, cut off the spool and split down to about the right size to be proportionate. We just run it through, we leave a tail. And then the real thing, that tail's probably about a foot long. It's a bit hard to work. I mean, normally we're working with needles that are needle size, and suddenly we're working with a needle that's like I don't know. That would be the equivalent of a foot long, so that can make things a little awkward sometimes. But anyhow, what we're doing is taking a few passes through here. So the equivalent of about 3 or 4 passes, maybe upwards of 6, but no more than that is necessary. And then we start lashing them off like that. Just half hitches around the whole thing, and that creates a cinching motion, and it brings these two strands together. You only need to do it probably 3 or 4 times, but sometimes I like to do more of them, stack up the knots just because it kind of looks interesting. If you do it, the half hitch knots in the same direction each time, always starting on the same side, the knots will start to spiral around or your bundle here. If you switch directions each time, it starts stacking little square knots up, basically, or clove hitches to be more accurate. So 3 or 4 is good. And on a real boat, what I would do is take my tail end and I would pass it through the bundle so that it's locked, can't wind back off, and maybe throw on one more half hitch. And then I would cut that and burn off the end. Since my needle's already on the other end and I haven't cut it yet, I can just take a tool, open up that bundle, put my tail through like so, and one more just to lock it off. And so I'm just going to clip these. Actually, I'll leave them a little bit long because it's easier if you have something to hang on to, and then you take a hot knife and you cut that guy with the knife and it'll burn off the end nicely. So just a little bit of slack to make that easier. I'll just do the same thing to the other end. And now that's secure, those are secure, and that end is done. It's not entirely done, I mean, we've got some more work to do, but it's done in terms of securing it. There'll be lashings all around here, so we don't need a bazillion dowels through here. It's not really going to help. You just need enough to secure that joint. For now, after the stem goes on, there's going to be a bunch of lashings that connect the stem to that, and that's going to secure this joint all in its entirety. Here's the drawings package. I'll just walk you through them. I suppose the heart of it is really this. This is the measured drawing of a Tahe kayak. As stated, these dimensions are uncorrected, which means they've been pulled off the scale drawing. I haven't drawn this full size in order to ensure that these are correct. So you'd have to learn proper lofting techniques to fully understand this stuff. In a nutshell, these are grid coordinates that all relate to lines on this drawing here. And so it's showing you the heights above the baseline for the shear line, the chine, and the keel, and the half breadths. That means from center line out to the shear line and the chine. I haven't included the one on the deck here. There's no numbers for that. That's just sort of a ghosted in drawing. If you look at the actual boat, you'll see how there's this sort of raised foredeck here with a hard chine that kind of feathers out. So you'll have to figure that stuff out from your own. You can scale off the drawings if you like to try and figure that stuff out. And there's a little cross section that shows all the angles and things like that. So you can extrapolate from those what you will. And then I've shown other details like the position of the skeg in the actual boat, which I tried putting one in a skin boat. I don't recommend it. It didn't work well. And then right off the drawing, you have these positions showing you the shapes of the stem here. And these are going to be in 6-inch intervals away from these stations. Each of these stations is set nominally a foot apart or 2 feet apart as displayed. 1/8 inch scale. The next drawing are features that exist on the actual boat, meaning the position of the cockpit, the deck lines, and the hatches. Next we have a drawing of some of the frame details as I would build them. Now this isn't necessarily exactly how I would build them every time, but this is just one interpretation. The most important part, if you wanted to recreate the Tahe, is to try and work from this drawing down here showing you what the shape of the gunnels need to be in the unbent form. So they need to sweep up 4.5 inches from the lower line here. So you need to add something like an extra couple inches onto the top or bottom of a straight piece of stock. You can cut the whole thing out of a sweep of stock, or you can cut a wedge off one side and glue it to the other side, which is the method I typically will use. And there's a few notes on the side about how I usually build boats and what you might want to use. Similar here, there's a few notes sort of showing how what I would normally do and how the Tahe differs a little bit. The most applicable, the most prescriptive, if you want to use it. It's a tracing of an actual Tahe cockpit here. So you could use that, although I'll note that I personally use them more of an ovoid shape. And then most prescriptive are these, which are the spreaders. There's like the central spreader or crossball, fore and aft spreaders, and then what we call a keeper. So those go inside the gunnels, and then those go on the outside, and they keep the gunnels from popping off. They keep them contained, and then you adjust the position of these to shape your boat so that you control how much recurve you might have in the boat. And then lastly, the type of thing that I use for setting the height of the keel, which helps to dictate the whole finished boat shape. And that is just sort of a short section of material with a notch for the keel, and then a little stick fastened to it that rests on one of the deck beams. So that's the drawing package, 5 drawings. As I said before, these are not intended to be complete plans on how to build a Greenlandic style kayak or complete plans on how to create a wooden interpretation of a Tahe, but they're intended to be sort of working notes to help guide you along the way. It's expected that you will have your own thoughts and input into how to recreate this shape, but maybe these will help you get started on your first version of it, and then you refine it from there as you get comfortable with how to create the shapes that you're gunning for.